Hey folks, welcome back. So today we're going to take a look at the wonderful source book for the Dune Adventures in the Imperium RPG from Modiphius called Sand and Dust, which is the Arrakis source book. It's got a fantastic cover. I really love this. We've got a striking portrait of a Fremen with their blue within blue eyes caused by the spice, and two ginormous sandworms right behind her, with Fremen fleeing in various degrees of activity, somebody riding the back of this worm. We've got ornithopters. I mean, everything that happens on Arrakis is happening in this shot, basically, which is great. On the back, of course, there's the usual summary of why you should buy this. Basically, it's a 156-page source book that's all about Arrakis and the people thereof. So it's got an overview of the planet, its history and its features, details on the Fremen and their many secrets, a host of new options for Fremen characters, including new archetypes, talents, and rules for riding the sandworms, which I felt really should have been in the core, but there you go. An in-depth look at spice harvesting and those who try to smuggle and stockpile it secretly. Secrets of spice revealed, including new spice-related talents and abilities. A gazetteer of Carthage and Arrakis, including their layout, noteworthy landmarks, and what life is like for the people of each city. Expanded notes on creating your own campaigns on Arrakis, including a host of new NPCs, scenario hooks, and story seed, which are super useful. New campaign options as smugglers, Fremen, or merchants instead of the agents of a noble house, which is also really nice. And finally, a complete adventure, which we will skip for spoiler reasons, but involves the player characters in a deadly plot during a water shortage on Arrakis. So, without further ado, let's take a look. As usual, the quality of the book itself is very high. Mine has a little bit of a ding here on the bottom that happened during shipping, but it wasn't enough for me to bother trying to make a return or something. So, don't take that as a demerit against the shipping methods of Modiphius. I bought this somewhere else and just decided that I didn't care, but in all likelihood, yours will be fine, so don't worry about it. We have nothing on the in papers, which is kind of surprising, but we do have a lovely copy of the cover art, of course, without the logos and such. Then we have a detailed TOC, and then we jump right into it. So basically, it's set up as a 5-chapter book. So the first one is about Arrakis Dune, Desert Planet, right? And we learn about different eras of play on Arrakis and what they would be like. The cities of Arrakis and Carthage, desert itself, the changing sands, so, what's happening over the course of the different eras of play to Arrakis and to the people thereof, and then what happens beyond the era of Muad'Dib. Then chapter 2 is all about the Fremen, so we get their history, we learn about their customs in the seitch and tribe, their technology, which includes a bunch of new assets, and the worm riding rules that were noted on the back. How Fremen deal with outsiders, their view of the Muad'Dib prophecy, which they call the Mahdi. Then what happens during the times of Muad'Dib. Then we get some more info on Fremen player characters. They note that, this is quite a popular option, but it can be hard to integrate them into campaigns, so they give some tips on that here. You can also create a seitch if you don't want to do a great house, and how to use Fremen characters in your game. Then we have some more details on spice, so the substance itself, the involvement of sandworms, and the activities of harvesting. Chapter 4 is particularly fun, I think. We get sort of summaries of why is Arrakis such a big deal. Part of it is its brutal, beautiful landscape. Part of it is its importance to the great houses. There's actually quite a lot of commerce happening there because of the spice trade, the black markets, the entertainments hidden in the bazaars and the back alleys of Arrakis and Carthage, the main factions that are present on the planet, and some ideas for campaigns set on Arrakis, including some samples. And then finally, we have the introductory adventure. So we jump right in. There's a nice intro here. The overview of Arrakis is pretty simple. It's basically a vast desert across the entire surface. There's only 2 cities, both of which are located in the northern polar region. Everything else is just really too hot, basically. And in this area in the northern polar region is one of the few places safe from the giant sandworms because of the natural shield wall barrier, which, if you remember, you could actually see on the map on the back of the GM screen, which is kind of cool. It also helps protect these storms protect the cities from the horrible, deadly sandstorms that form in the desert. They're driven by the Coriolis force as the planet rotates and can become extremely deadly, tearing flesh from bone and even ripping metal apart. Even the Fremen can't survive such storms. Then they talk a little bit about both the natives and the non-natives who live on Arrakis, and the lure of Arrakis. Why would you want to build a world on this, build a campaign on this horrible place? And the answer is always the spice. But there are also the secrets of the Fremen and is a hotbed of politics. So even if you're not directly involved in, say, running the spice trade, your house may have some interest therein, or other aspects of politics may draw them to Arrakis for one reason to another. Some political intrigue and espionage lurks around every corner in Arrakis, so you must be careful. And then again here we have a lovely, very visual appealing summary of the 5 different chapters as well. But as they note, perhaps Arrakis is where a story of greatness begins. But be wary, the sands of Dune are littered with the bodies of the ambitious. What will you do to ensure you do not join their number? A good question to consider for any player. Again, we have a great 2-page spread here of artwork. We see what looks to be an approaching sandstorm, and this poor guy crashes ornithopter. And we have some Fremen here trying to decide, well, what's going to happen to this guy? I presume they will leave him and take his water, if possible, but, that's how they do. So then we get into the history of Arrakis. I'm going to skip through a lot of this, because again, if you haven't read the books, then knowing too much about these aspects will spoil things for you. But they do go into eras of play beyond the first 2 books. So we talk about the era of the God Emperor, the era of the Scattering, post-God Emperor Leto II, and the Age of the Enemy, which is when the Honored Matrix come back, fleeing an unknown enemy in the beyond the known universe, basically. Then we get into the main aspects of Arrakeen. So it's the larger of the 2 cities on Arrakis, but still relatively small compared to settlements on other worlds, because honestly, not a lot of people want to live in such a forbidding place. So during the Harkonnen rule, Arrakeen is the home of the Imperial Advisor and his wife. And then eventually when the Atreides won the governorship, Duke Laird Atreides chose the residency as his own, settling in the more secure and less Harkonnen-infested Arrakeen. Carthage was kind of the main base of Harkonnen operations during that period, so he thought it'd be safer in Arrakeen. As you'll see in the book, he may or may not be correct about this. As far as the residency period, so there's some NPC plot hooks, like the head housekeeper in the late Imperium was Shed-Out Mapes. She was watching the place on behalf of her people. So, she's an interesting one to get to know and can be a useful one to get to know. Hema Kulain, one of the many cooks in the kitchens, can hunt down special ingredients. We have Jasker Grames, a talented assassin on deep cover assignment with the residency staff. And he's instructed to build this cover till he's activated. Of course, we also have some possible rumors of mistreatment and exploitation of the locals. Agents of an unknown power are responsible for spreading these. They want to incite the citizenry to riot. There's some possible encounters, a deadly gas trap set for an incoming enemy. Then within the residency, there's a conservatory garden, which is quite a luxury. So it's filled with flora from across the Imperium. It was basically purely for show and decoration, and the Fremen and the natives found this absolutely sacrilegious, basically. It was a tremendous waste of water just for entertainment, and survival is paramount on Arrakis. So there's some adventure hooks here as well. We have the old gardener, a young guard assigned to protect the conservatory, a maid to Lady Margot who stayed on to serve the Atreides. She loves the gardens and wonders about the world outside of her world. There's rumors of conspiracy of smugglers siphoning water from the garden. And of course there's encounters and hazards there as well. The merchant quarter is where you'll find your water sellers, stillsuit manufacturers, and other Dune-specific industry. There are some more extravagant and water-reckless structures for the wealthy merchants and manufacturers. So it's a mix of classes, really. You'll find the basics of survival, frem kits, stillsuits, emergency supplies for the desert, etc. But you'll find more extravagant goods as well amongst some of the more opulent areas of the market. We've got some nice NPCs set up here. Tailors, spice smuggler, a water seller, some rumors from a local ornithopter manufacturer, and an encounter as a young child is being beaten up by a wealthy merchant. There's the Arrakeen spaceport, which was originally quite modest, but by the time Atreides took this over, there was quite a lot of space at the spaceport, actually. And by the time of Emperor Muad'Dib, again, spoilers, this was a bustling spaceport for ships of all sizes. There's some nice NPCs to find here, too. The senior customs official, who is addicted to Samuta, so he's kind of got a weakness there. We've got Maman Unger, a transplant from Gedi Prime, who stayed after the Harkonnen left. We have an Atreides guard native to Caladan, who's part of a covert unit tasked with looking for smugglers. And the rumors and plot hooks, in fact, deal with smuggling, because, to get off the planet, you have to get to the guild Hayliners somehow. And there's a cool encounter about a sabotage ship crashing into the landing pad. Then we have the Keep. So this was a grand fortress during the reign of Muad'Dib. Again, I'm going to get a little bit more speeding through some of this stuff because we're getting into spoiler territory here for those who don't know much about the background of the future books. So again, we have some key NPCs, rumors and plot hooks, adventures and hazards. Then we have Aaliyah's temple. Then we have the refuge. So this is where the poor district reside in Arrakis, basically. So crime is rife, and if the Harkonnen ever bothered to sort of wander in, they would just sort of beat people and kill them until things calm down. Paul sought to revivify these areas when given the opportunity by providing, accommodation for veterans and for people who were participating in his activities. So, of course, that was a big change, and reaction to that is mixed. Under Muad'Dib, it becomes a comfortable and generally affluent area, but not a grand one. Then we get into Carthage. So this is the other significant megalopolis in Arrakis. It's about 200 kilometers northeast from Arrakis across the Broken Land. It's also located on a northern cap within shield wall because, for the same reasons as before. You're safe from the sandworms. It's a walled city, but it's on higher and rockier ground, so it's already less prone to a sandworm attack. So the best way to get there is by ornithopter. And many of the buildings in Carthage, in fact, have landing pads for that very purpose. So this was built by House Harkonnen soon after they were granted control of Arrakis. And it served as the home of the Harkonnens on Dune, becoming the planet's new capital as soon as they were finished constructing it. So Duke Leto chose Arrakis as the capital, reasoning that would be easier to defend, and it wouldn't have the, quote, Harkonnen stench. So then we have some details about the Harkonnen residency in Carthage, with some NPC plot hooks, nice rumors, and of course there's lots of hazards and encounters here, because the Harkonnen are nothing if not brutal. We have the city guard. So they're tasked with obeying the governor, protecting Harkonnen interests, and preventing violence. They can sound alarms and lock down the populace, instituting martial law basically whenever they want. There's about 1,000 of them, so they're pretty ruthless, and they tend to be tough opponents as well. So you want to avoid tussling with them too much. But yeah, there are plenty of opportunities to interact with the city guard if you find yourself in Carthage. There's a spaceport, but it's big enough to land about a dozen vessels up to frigate size. So it's actually pretty decent in size, but I don't think it stands up to what we see in the later eras of Arrakis on Arrakis. Of course, there are some smuggling and conflict between the Harkonnens and the Fremen happening in Carthage. And because of the higher ground, sometimes sandstorms do reach the spaceport, which can lead to shutdown. Which is one of the hazards listed there. Then we have the Merchant District, which, like in Arrakis, has a multitude of options for shopping, for merchandise, food, water, transport, or services, both legal and illegal. There's a packed bazaar, which is noisy and chaotic, and that's where you'll find a lot of your sort of Dune-specific stuff, like taxi and doctor drivers, tailors, weapons, drugs, still suits, etc. We got some cool rumors and plot hooks and NPCs there. And we have the Colosseum. So the Harkonnens in particular, they love gladiatorial battles. In particular, the Beast Rabban loves a good gladiatorial fight. So Harkonnen cities almost always have an arena to allow that to happen. Harkonnen fighters almost always win because they don't fight fair. So bear that in mind. So this one is meant in Carthage is modeled after the one on the main Harkonnen world of Gaiety Prime. And as the slave gladiators emerge through a red door, there'll be musicians playing them in. They typically carry a shield or semi-shield, and the customary pairing of dual knives for a duel. Poison one in the white-gloved right hand and a non-poison one in the black-gloved left hand. So thanks to a variety of tricks, basically the Harkonnen can always win. But in case they're somehow losing, there's a prudence door on the arena floor that openly opens for those wearing an Ixian-designed authorized identification band. I mean, that's really poor. If you're going to be in a gladiatorial fight and you have all these tricks to hand and you're still losing, I think you should just accept the consequences at that point. To have a special escape door really is pretty cowardly in my opinion. But, that's the Harkonnens for you. So there's loads of cool stuff you can do there, of course. The gladiators are usually slaves doomed to a terrible outcome, so you might want to free them. You might get a lot of benefit from helping them. But the Harkonnens will be pissed off, so it's a good story hook there. There are 10 huge silos on the outskirts of the city that store the Harkonnen spice stockpiles. So they're usually under heavy guard, and they include lots of scanner technology, and there's ornithopters patrolling around and stuff. But there's an interesting plot hook here about, some say that one of the spice silos doesn't house spice at all, but a captive sandworm. Is this true, or is the occupant of the silo something even stranger? That sounds to me like a pretty cool adventure hook for like an interesting one-shot on Arrakis. Then we have the Waterfall District. So this is not reflecting an actual waterfall, because of course this is Arrakis we're talking about, but it's basically where the wealthy people live. So we got some interesting rich people to meet. There's some plot hooks about a water sailor's manor and a wealthy arms dealer, and some run-ins with well-dressed movers and shakers that seem to have a mysterious purpose. Then we have the residential district, which is where the middle class lives, the functionaries, merchants, mechanics, accountants, and so forth. So this is where you'll have apartments, local restaurants and stuff like that. And then you'll find, of course, Carthage city slums filled with the downtrodden and the damaged. Structures here are sort of prefab, plascrete buildings. The taller buildings are kind of precariously, poorly held together. And they're massive just dumps of landfill, basically. The slums are desperate and dangerous, so well worth being careful, not just because of the locals' desperation, but the possible amusement of the city guard who may come to beat up people just for the heck of it. Then we get into the desert, which, of course, there's a few different desert environments. We have northern polar sink, where the cities are. So it's on most planets, it would still be considered pretty much barely livable, but it's by far the most livable place on Arrakis, so that's where the cities are. The open bled are the open seas of sand, basically. The temperatures become truly ridiculous out there, and if you don't have a still suit and great knowledge of the desert, then lasting more than a few days is pretty unlikely. Many, if not most, species of Arrakeen vegetation are also poisonous, but some few are edible and can provide a few milliliters of water in an emergency. Fremen also know other techniques, but don't necessarily teach them freely. In the very deep desert, far from the spice sands, are a handful of vast salt pans. So these are hard and deeply inhospitable, hundreds of kilometers in size. The great sandworms don't go near these, but they're also not good for refuge. The surface has been baked hard, and there's no shade and no moisture, just an endless plain of salt on which you'll sort of shrivel up and die. The sinks, however, are good places of refuge. So these are geological depressions ringed by cliffs and stone deposits. These are usually dominated by long-established communities or used as military bases if they're close to the northern polar region. In the deeper desert, you'll find smugglers or Fremen seitches in these kind of places. So you don't want to trespass, or if you do so very carefully, because you may end up in a duel or a fight to the death with somebody at least. Hazards of the sands, of course, there's quite a few of those. And they also mention the spice blow. So occasionally, when certain circumstances are fulfilled beneath the desert surface, you'll have a powerful explosion called a spice blow. There's not a lot of warning signs. You'll just get a faint smell of the spice just a few minutes before the explosion. So if you suddenly catch a whiff of the spice out of nowhere, I would say either worry about worms or worry about spice blows. So just be careful. They talk a bit about wildlife. So there are some arthropods, i.e. insects. So there are beetles, flies, wasps, and stuff. There are some spider-type things, scorpion-type things. And there are some small mammals, such as Muad'Dib is a name for a small mouse that lives in the desert. There are also some species of birds of prey and specialized seed-eating birds. Most of the planet's wildlife is native, but basically that's because if you try to bring a species to Arrakis, they probably will die. It's just not very good. So now we get into the sort of history of Arrakis, both kind of in a personal and ecological sense. So the planetologist's vision, if you read the first book, you get a lot of this interesting information from the work of Liet Kynes, which is laid out at the end of the first book as kind of a separate little appendix. So, there have been people on Arrakis for a long time, basically, but the first people were not the Fremen. The Fremen developed out of the earlier migration of the Zen-Sunni wanderers who fled enslavement on Portatrine in one of the early space-folding ships. They crashed on Arrakis and were adopted into a band of outlaws, and then their culture sort of dominated and eventually sort of transmogrified into the Fremen ways, and of course was influenced by certain other factions in the galaxy who you may be aware of, but I will not spoil for you at this time. Then here we're into heavy spoiler territory, so the greening of the deserts, the Jihad, the Holy Imperium, the God Emperors, Arrakis. The planet changes a lot over the course of the series, we'll just say that. Beyond Muad'Dib, spoilers, we get terraforming, we get Dune being faded into obscurity, and then coming back into the story in a major way again. That's all I'm going to tell you. Chapter 2 is all about the Fremen, and we have a nice quote here. Truth suffers from too much analysis, which is an ancient Fremen saying. Again, lovely 2-page spread to introduce us. So we get a history again, this time much more detailed about the history of the Fremen, so how they came from the Zen-Sunni wanderers and their sort of migration through the galaxy and their sort of pathway that they took to eventually end up on Arrakis. And once they were there, the dangers to the environment actually turned out to be very helpful, because very few people bothered with this planet, with the deep desert, the heat, the winds, the terrible giant sandworms. So the Zen-Sunni adapted and found that they could keep themselves hidden here better than anywhere else they'd been before. So that was a blessing rather than a curse. And the culture of the Zen-Sunni blossomed into the Fremen over time, but life and survival is still a constant struggle. And with the arrival of Liet Kynes, there was this idea that spread throughout the Fremen community that someday Arrakis could be made green and verdant and healthy place to live, rather than something so parched and drowned of at the last drip of moisture. Then we've got a great section about seitches and the cultures within them. So life within the seitch. In the ancient Fremen tongue, the word originally meant the place of assembly in times of danger, but in time it came to be their word for their permanent settlements in the deep desert. So seitches are usually led by a naib, and there will be a lively community hidden in these places. The social hierarchy is relatively flat, basically, but there is a naib who's kind of a first among equals, and invariably the naib is somebody who has won their role through the challenge of combat. They're expected to be not just fierce, but wise, and those who endanger their seat or tribe will find themselves facing an endless series of challenges. Ultimately, it is the naib or naibs who will make the most critical decisions for the entire community, and they will be held accountable for their choices. While the naib leads the tribe in practical matters, it falls to the reverend mothers and the sayadina to tend to their spiritual well-being. Most every seitch, or sometimes each tribe, will have its own reverend mother, a priestess who has transmuted the poisonous water of life and gained access to the ancestral memories of the tribe. So the rest of the seitch looks on her with reverence and awe. She spends much of her time in religious contemplation and counseling those who require her wisdom. So yeah, the spiritual needs are tended to by the Bene Gesserit, basically, and the safety of the seitch is responsibility of the naib. So they give you a nice outline of what a day is like in a day in the life of the seitch, basically, when special occasions arise, and the common traits and personalities of the Fremen. So, of course, every Fremen is an individual like anybody else, but from an outsider's point of view, they have certain notable traits. Basically, they barely talk, except when they have something necessary to say. Speaking uses water. So it's not like an insult or being rude. It's just that they are trained from birth to never waste water ever. And so they can kind of give the impression of being terse and hostile, but really it's just how they are. As warriors, they're happy to risk their lives in battle, but the harsh realities of their day-to-day existence make the Fremen seem deliberate and careful in their movements. They don't waste energy on activities they view as trivial. They have a strong sense of fidelity and duty to their family and tribe. The closer the relationship, the stronger the bond. And they're always wary of strangers and those who are not part of their culture. And given how the ruling houses have treated them in the past, that's totally makes sense. Their attitudes to life and death are pretty bizarre, according to other people. So basically, when somebody dies, their water is returned to the tribe through the death still. And basically, if you go to a Fremen funeral, it seems very perfunctory. Basically, people might sort of step forward and give an anecdote for a second and step back. But if somebody was particularly worthy, shedding a tear could be considered not an affront, as it would normally be, but it'd be considered giving water to the dead, which is a mark of honor and deep, deep respect. But generally, there are no tears at a Fremen funeral unless you're somebody extremely important, because, of course, why waste the water, right? And they go a little bit about how the still suit itself has been sort of central to the development of the lives of the Fremen. I mean, it's made their lifestyle possible. So when one of the Fremen has died, they're placed within the death stills so that the last of their water can be reclaimed, and the water from their still suit is collected. The still suit itself is carefully removed and kept should be needed in the future. A still suit is almost never removed, save in an individual's own quarters. Every molecule of water wasted costs the Fremen and the tribe. So they're basically clothed in full still suit at all times, which means when you take them off, it must be a horrible stench, if you ask me. And there's some interesting cultural details, basically. So, for example, the Fremen act of spitting is generally considered very insulting everywhere else, but just like giving water to the dead is given only to the most worthy, so is spitting. Giving somebody water from your mouth is a means of showing that you're very important to that person, either as an individual, as a collective. So to offer water in any form, spit, tears, whatever, is the ultimate honor the Fremen can give to you. And it's also a binding oath. So once you get that, you get some offering of spit or tears, that also comes with a certain expectation, and it's not easy to live up to. There are Fremen outcasts, so if you steal water, despised individuals lose the honor of returning their water to the tribe because their water is fetid. It's the most reprehensible crime you can commit. So in olden times, many generations before the Atreides, sietch Jacurutu had been stealing water from other Fremen tribes. They stalked isolated and injured Fremen in the open desert, killed them, then dragged their bodies to the nearest death still. The Fremen tribes banded together, traveled to that sietch, and slaughtered everyone. They showed no mercy. Men, women, children, they spared no one. With death stills reserved only for the untainted, the water of Jacurutu's Fremen painted the sietch's walls and evaporated on the sand. This massacre even included the Sayadina, forever removing the memory and history of the tribe. However, not everybody from Jacurutu was in the sietch that night, so there were some survivors, or so the stories say, and these outcasts are still scattered, perhaps somewhere out in the deep desert. And we may find that out in the book series, but who knows? I'm trying to avoid spoilers and doing a very poor job, but at least I'm trying. So then we get into Fremen technology. So some of that we know about, still suits, etc. But there's more details here. And so, for example, a functional fitted Fremen still suit enables the wearer to endure up to 2 months in the deep desert, provided they have a source of food. I mean, that's an incredible accomplishment given the extreme hostility of this environment, right? The Frem kit includes everything you need for desert survival from a Fremen perspective, and they're kept in caches for quick access in an emergency. So they typically have a paracompass, a knife, a still tent, maker hooks, a thumper, replacement parts for your still suit, and emergency patches in case you have a hole in your still suit. Basically, it just allows you to survive in the desert for a short period as an asset. Then you have the Chris knife, and we get a lot more detail on that here. Basically, they must only be drawn in genuine need and may not be resheathed without first drawing blood. They're considered sacred, and they're carved from the tooth of a sandworm. They're typically 0.2 meters in length from tip to pommel, and they typically have a finger-ridged grip. The blade is milky white, the natural color of polished sandworm tooth, and sometimes coated with a fast-acting and lethal poison. So as an asset, it's a status symbol for an outsider among Fremen to show that one is a friend. They're an effective weapon against shielded opponents. And as far as quality goes, even though its meager Chris knife has a quality of 1, most are 2 or 3, and the poison used may increase the quality even further. They also use distrans bats, so these are small species of desert bats, which they use as couriers. A tiny steganographic device is implanted in the bat by which it can carry a temporary neurally delivered message. An individual can speak a message to the bat, which then carries to a distant location. The recipient speaks a trigger word or phrase, and the bat then responds with its normal vocations, which carry the encoded message, which can then be deciphered by a second distrans receiver device. They're also used as pest control inside the sietches. They eat bugs and stuff, and are treated as loyal companions. So as an asset, they ensure private and secure communications. The death still, of course, we know it's used to recover water from the bodies of the dead. The device is activated, and a combination of pressure and heat evaporates all the moisture from a body, which is then gathered and precipitated back into distilled water to be deposited in a container or directly into the sietch's overall catch basin. So as an asset, we can gather precious water from the dead and use it for the living. If you have water as an asset, of course, it's a vital element of survival for anyone on Dune, but for the Fremen, it is a mark of belonging and a mark of status. So as an asset, this means we're talking about a large stash of water, so just like what you might find within a sietch. The water of life is what the Reverend Mother, or the sisters rather, of the Bene Gesserit must change into a harmless narcotic in order to prove they are worthy of the title of Reverend Mother. So it's a powerful narcotic as well as a deadly poison, and it's filled with loads of spice, but it can be made by a Sayadina with advanced training, such as a Bene Gesserit sister. So the unchanged water of life is a deadly poison. So to have it as an asset suggests you are on a very special mission or being trusted by the Fremen. If you have the change poison, the ritual of change doesn't produce a lot of change water, and because only a sip is needed for it to start the whole sietch off into a narcotic drugs party. There isn't usually any left after the celebration, and it's a sacred substance, so they don't really sell it. So if you have some, people might ask you why. Water rings are interesting things, so whenever a Fremen kills off somebody and claims their water, the dead's water is weighed from the death still, and then they're given a metallic ring denominating the volume of the water. These rings then permit the bearer to draw that water from the tribe's communal basin or give them in trade to another. And sort of significantly, these rings are a key element of Fremen courtship rituals. So if you want to marry someone, you offer your water rings to the bride, and if she accepts, they'll weave them through her hair or convert them into earrings, and that will mark an acceptance of her proposal. Then we have the will of the Ichwan Bedouin. So if the Fremen are a close-knit society, should a member of a sietch be traveling on behalf of several tribes, then they might be said to be carrying the will of the Ichwan Bedouin. This causes all Fremen to aid the carrier however they can, rendering them shelter, water, and assistance of whatever kind is needed. It's a potent asset bestowed only in rare circumstances. And as an asset, basically the Fremen are completely at your disposal. They'll host you, they'll feed you, they'll give you weapons, they'll provide water for you. It's rare for a Fremen to be given that role, let alone an outsider, but it's essentially a priceless asset. It means you can freely travel the deep desert with the full assistance of the Fremen by your side. Then we have the Thumper, which makes a rhythmic thumping sound on the desert to draw sandworms, useful for calling or distracting sandworms. You can send them towards somewhere away from you, or you can draw them towards you to attempt to ride. Of course, the maker hooks are used to guide sandworms into enemy locations or to use them to travel across Arrakis. And then we have finally the rules for worm riding. Basically, it's kind of a ritual that the Fremen complete to show that they are kind of fully grown. Fremen children are taught the basics from an early age, and most master the act no later than their early teens. Only the oldest and youngest are exempted from attaining proficiency. So the basic idea is you set a thumper. Its rhythmic clapping will inevitably bring a worm, given enough time, and then you must position yourself correctly according to the conditions of the sand, the wind, and their own position relative to the thumper and the likely worm's arrival. Then you hook into the armored outside segments of the worm with your maker hooks and pull them open. The worm will instinctively roll those segments away from the sand to avoid the irritating sand coming under the armored plates and irritating its sensitive skin. So that then allows you to sort of roll along with your maker hooks to the top of the sandworm and to steer it then as well with your hooks. So the rules are basically, it's extraordinarily difficult for the uninitiated, but quite easy for Fremen who do it all the time. So a character who's familiar with the processes will typically find them to be a difficulty of 2, but if you have no training, you'll find a difficulty of 4, if not 5. Complications can happen because of the terrain, the weather, or if you're under time pressure. So basically, it's an extended test, and the character in question will only have time to make 3 dice rolls to gain the points for the requirement. So you need to make an understand roll, a discipline roll as the worm rises from the sand, and a move roll to make sure you plant your maker hooks correctly. And basically, you don't know what kind of worm you're going to get, so you need to roll on this table as well. And if you get Shai-Hulud, you need 16 points from those 3 rolls, so you better have a lot of momentum and skills and talents and stuff. So basically, if you get enough points to meet the requirement for the size of the worm, then you find yourselves on the back of one of the great sandworms of Dune, and you can take it to wherever you please. For others who want to ride down your coattails, they just need to do a move test of difficulty 2 to catch a rope up, climb up the worm, and join you. Leaving the worm when it's tired doesn't require any test, but if you need to call another worm to keep going, then you'll need to do the test again. Usually a sandworm can be used to travel hundreds of kilometers before it becomes exhausted, and then it very slowly buries itself to kind of recover. So depending on where you're going, it might be only one worm needed, or you might need to call several. But either way, they're efficient ways to get across the desert. And certainly, nobody will be able to stop you on the way because the sandworms are ridiculously powerful. Then we have some interesting stuff about Fremen dealing with outsiders. They're notoriously insular, distrustful, and reclusive, which makes sense. They live by a harsh philosophy, which is driven by the necessities of their environment. If you intrude on their territory, it's very, very risky. You need to kind of be prepared to be shot at or stabbed or at least interrogated with some vigor so they can figure out what the hell you want. The Fremen and the common people of Arrakis, basically most people who live in the streets of Arrakis and Carthage who are not Fremen and who have come there to work for other reasons, they often don't see Fremen really, except for, when they see them here and there in the street or at the market. And there's a general feeling that they're just kind of violent tribesmen, occasionally. The Fremen see almost all outsiders as water-soft dilettantes competing for the planet's scarce resources, at best liabilities, at worst dangerous enemies. However, the Fremen recognize the necessity of trade, so most tribes and seitches have individuals who are responsible for trading with merchants and tradespeople. So that's why you see Fremen showing up in the markets and so on. Some Fremen do have genuine friendships through having jobs like this, because they're the ones nominated to go outside the sietch and deal with the people in civilization. And Fremen do occasionally gain employment, so if they're they can be found among the crews of spice harvesting operations, because their knowledge of the desert is very worthy. They're typically less there for the monetary reward and more to surveil desert operations and preventing outsiders from seeing things they shouldn't, like where seitches are. And sometimes Fremen have sabotage operations to, or even led them into lethal ambushes. So Fremen also sometimes participate in smuggling or mercenary activities, since they're really good warriors. They don't care about imperial legalities because, that's why they're happy to hang out with smugglers. And basically they feel that Arrakis is their planet. They're the only ones who truly understand it and who can navigate it. So whatever the Imperium wants to do with it, it's their place. Basically, the houses of the Landsraad, for a similar reason, are basically nearly irrelevant. The rulers of Arrakis generally pay little attention to the people of the deep desert, but occasionally they use the Fremen as scapegoats, and in those cases there can be conflict. We've seen that the Harkonnen will do that in occasion. For their part, the Fremen see the great houses as another expression of the oppression they've escaped in the desert. The Fremen are adept at evasion and surprisingly so well informed by their contact with city folk and outsiders that they are rarely more than inconvenienced by an incursion from the great houses. Still, they have long memories and never forget a wrongdoing. So there you go. They do have a relationship with the Space Guild, however. They want to keep their activities in the Desert Ways secret from prying eyes, so that's been key to their survival for a long, long time. On most worlds, the Guild maintains a bunch of weather control and surveillance satellites that benefit the planetary inhabitants, but it's a resource of significant profit. So the Fremen recognized immediately that this would be an easy way for people to find them out in the desert. However, they're in possession of something that might tempt the Guild, which is the spice. So basically, the Guild have access to a secondary source free from imperial taxation of the spice melange. And so the Fremen offer a yearly tribute in return for keeping the skies clear from orbital monitoring. So the Guild always will stick with this deal when houses offer or ask for some kind of satellite monitoring system. So they've been good to their word so far on this. And the transaction is conducted annually via Guild lighters that touch down in an appointed place far from the gaze of outsiders. Only the most trustworthy of Fremen warriors are chosen to take part in this trade. Seasoned warriors accompanying the most diplomatically minded naibs. It is still a potentially fraught moment, even though it's been going on for many years, and any interference from outside will be met with severe and immediate repercussion. Now we have a bit about Muad'Dib. So again, this is book spoilers galore. Let's skip it. Skipping all this stuff, and we'll go to Fremen player characters. So now this section offers new talents, new traits, and new character options. All to offer Fremen player characters a means of customizing their siege members before sending them out into the jaws of Shai-Hulud. So you can create life events for your character by rolling on this table. Perhaps they were a child of the storm, a water thief, a chosen of Shai-Hulud, lover of battle, or a true believer, all of which are explained here. And so each of these kind of origins has repercussions as far as how you're seen by the siege. There's some new focuses as well. Desert navigation, Fremen crafting, Fremen culture, interpretation, so learning the truth of dreams and visions, leadership, the use of firearms like mala pistols or dart guns, which are Fremen innovations, rifle, the use of non-laser gun rifle weapons, speech making, stillness, so this is useful when lying in wait or remaining unobtrusive, working and carving in stone, being a stonemason, weather lore, so that's helpful if you think a sandstorm might be brewing. And there's some new Fremen templates as well. We've got the Naib, who is the war leader and protector of the siege, as we know. He gains the trait Naib with a primary skill of battle, secondary skill of understand. And he gets focuses in dueling and leadership. His talents are ways of the Ichwan Bedouin, and to know someone is to fight them. Drive-wise, the survival of the siege is the most important thing. Before all else, the protection of the Fremen under their command is their focus. So it's duty toward their siege in the long term. The Fedaykin, basically these are the most dedicated fighters the Fremen have, and they eventually became the elite guard for a certain individual, and were known sometimes as death commandos. They're fearsome fighters who have dedicated their lives to the blade. So they gain the trait Fedaykin, primary skill battle, secondary skill move, focuses in dueling and short blades. They have the talent bold, battle, and crysknife master, and their drives are exacting retribution by any means necessary. Justice underpinned by their faith in the Fremen way. Then we have the Sayadina. So they look out for the spiritual well-being of the tribe. They have the trait Sayadina, primary skill understand, secondary skill communicate, focuses in deductive reasoning and empathy, and the talent ways of the Ichwan Bedouin. So they preserve the truth of a Fremen's past, rather. Then there are the Sandrunners. So these are people that are particularly skilled at riding the worm. So they have the trait Sandrunner, primary skill move, secondary skill discipline, focuses in resolve and self-control. They have the talent of Chosen of Shai-Hulud and Peace of Shai-Hulud. So generally, duty to the tribe is what matters, but some enjoy the power they feel by riding Shai-Hulud. And for others, it's about truth, as to ride a sandworm is the ultimate expression of being a Fremen. Then we have the Wali. They are the young, untested members of the tribe. So their primary skill is discipline, secondary is battle, and they have focuses in self-control and stamina. They have talents of walk without rhythm and water wisdom. So they know basics of the Fremen way, but they are yet to specialize into sand runners or other types of Fennecan or other things. Finally, you could be an ecologist. You might dream of a transformed Arrakis, filling you with longing and dedication. So you're an ecologist. Your primary skill is discipline. Your secondary skill is understand. And you have talents in Fremen technology and water wisdom. They must have faith, or they'll never believe this whole idea is even possible. But they also need discipline, as the work is long and requires patience and sacrifice. So we got new talents as well. I'll give a few examples here. We've got Chosen of Shai-Hulud, Fremen only. So basically this is the Sand Runner talent. There are 3 tests to be made to capture a sandworm: move, discipline, and understand. Pick one. When making a test, you may reduce the difficulty by 2. You can take this talent up to 3 times with a different skill chosen each time. So potentially you could have a reduction of 2 automatically to all 3 tests if you take it 3 times. Crisp Knife Master is really good as well. When using a crisp knife, you may automatically generate 1 free point of momentum whenever you succeed during an attack. That's very cool. Let's see, Jakurutu. So this is an interesting one. You're adept at manipulating Fremen to maintain your cover and live among those who would call you outcast. The difficulty for you to deceive any Fremen is reduced by 1. Peace of Shai-Hulud. So you reduce the difficulty to see worm sign by 1. If you do see a worm, you always know which direction it's going in and how long it will take to get there. As such, any attempt to avoid it has a difficulty reduced by 1. Walk without rhythm. So when crossing an open sand, you do not need to make a test to see if you can avoid attracting a worm. However, anything other than walking may provoke a test as normal. And then we have rules for crafting your seitch. So you start by working out the size, which will determine the relative level of influence of the community. And so each tribe will have a reputation amongst the overall Fremen community. So you can roll here for that, and you'll be known as for nothing. You might be disliked, you might be known, trusted, or admired, in which case you'll get difficulty modifiers when trying to convince a member of another tribe to follow your lead, and you'll have a certain number of enemies as well. And your reputation, so you'll be known for certain things. Perhaps you produce the best worm riders, the best fighters, or the best ecologists, who knows. Every tribe has a few enemies. To know why they dislike you and how bad the animosity is, they ask you to use the tables for house creation in the core rulebook for that. Fremen characters in the game, it's kind of interesting because Fremen are basically fairly distrustful of outsiders, but they give you some ideas of how to start a Fremen-based game. Obviously, you can make your own seitch and do a whole Fremen game. Maybe they're smuggling spice to the guild, or doing things to undermine the Harkonnens, or testing out the trustworthiness of the Atreides. All types of stories can be told from a Fremen perspective, and also Fremen non-player characters are very cool as well, because they can provide info about and deep knowledge of the secrets of Arrakis that nobody else will know. And gaining their trust is a long and difficult process. So there's lots of interesting adventures and story hooks that could result from trying to gain the trust of a Fremen, gain access to their society, and to learn and to be respected by them. Yeah, and then we get into the politics of spice, which of course drives a lot of what happens on Arrakis. So there's some details here about what the substance is. The spice gas that you see in the chambers of the Guild Navigators is a deep orange color. Unrefined spice is said to have a blue glow. Basically, the scent is always a kind of cinnamon type scent. It's quite potent. Its taste, though, is something quite different. A lot of the local food on Arrakis, of course, is tinged with spice, just by nature of the fact that it's everywhere in the air. But skilled cooks will use it in interesting ways. And it has a benefit of basically extending your lifespan to about 200 years if you take it regularly. That's why they call it, often in the books, they call it the geriatric spice, because it extends your lifespan. And of course, the second and most remarkable properties of spice is that it gives you this sense of prescience. So for most people who take spice, they will get relatively small scale visions, but the dedicated guild navigators who spend their whole existence consuming spice in both solid and gas form and gradually mutate, we'll be able to see throughout to the galaxy, to other planets, and to see across the vast distances of interstellar space. The eyes of Ibad is what they call locally the phenomenon where your entire eye is blue from edge to edge. The Fremen call it the eyes of Ibad, but nobody knows why. Basically, if you have spice addiction, you will have blues like that. However, despite the relative frequency of spice ingestion amongst the noble houses, you typically don't see that kind of level of staining in such a way unless you're living on Arrakis, because spice is all around you. Then, of course, we have the Water of Life, which includes element of the spice and is then basically taken by a chosen member of the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, and she undergoes this ritual of consuming the Water of Life to convert it to harmless water. Well, not harmless water, but this narcotic thing. And then they have a sort of orgiastic celebration, and she becomes Reverend Mother. The sweat of the sister undergoing this trial is then collected and hoarded. The substance possesses great potency and can be used in place of spice. Only a woman meticulously trained in the Bene Gesserit's tradition of Prana Bindu can endure the extreme pain of the process. No man who has ever attempted it has succeeded. All died in considerable agony, and the Bene Gesserit believe it to be impossible for a man to undergo the ritual. So there you go. Then we have the cost of doing business. So they always mention this. At one stage, the price of a decagram of spice was 620,000 solaries, rendering melange the most expensive substance in the universe by some considerable distance. So that explains why it's such a lucrative business to be involved in, but also dangerous. So there are new talents related to spice. So if you have spice as an asset, this counts as a tube or canister of spice containing enough for one adult human dose. It could be essence, capsules, or gas, depending. It can be used as a bargaining tool, and it can unlock certain traits and talents when you ingest it. So if you have the spice lore talent, then you may re-roll up to 2 d20s on an understand test related to spice. If you know about spice refinement, then when your character is attempting a task related to the mechanics and logistics of spice production, you gain 1 free d20 for your roll. Improved healing. If you're taking spice regularly, then once per scene, you can re-roll 1 d20 that results in a complication, if the potential complication is an injury. And you can also get an enhanced lifespan if you're taking spice regularly. Any complication or trait they have due to old age can be ignored at the cost of 1 momentum. If you stop the supply of spice, though, for more than a few days, the talent is lost until you can restore your spice supply. Then you have mental spice talents, so you can gain the asset of foresight, or the talents of foresight, rather. At the beginning of a scene, you may ask the Game Master 2 questions about the nature of the scene about to play out, or you can choose or alter one of the defining attributes of the scene. Your character then immediately suffers one consequence of the Game Master's choosing, as a result of the damage inflicted on your character's psyche by this reckless use of a power they are ill-adapted to. Wow. Shortening the way, so to use this talent, you consume 1 spice asset, and for the remainder of the scene, all move tests they make are 1 step lower in difficulty. If you consume 1 spice asset, you can also use Voice of the Inner Dark, so you're unlocking some wisdom of their past memories to grant clarity. You may ask the Game Master 1 question about the scene that deeper experience or past knowledge might help uncover. You gain the Exhausted trait for the next day, and if they attempt to use this power again in that time frame, it functions normally, but afterward the character dies. Pretty serious. Then we have the life cycle of the sandworms and their relation to the spice, which again, read the books. Don't want to spoil it for you. Sandworms in gameplay. Anyone who's involved in any aspect of the spice industry is going to be involved in spice and be aware of Shai-Hulud and their dangers. Though player characters are generally at the upper levels of confidence, being able to face a wide variety of challenges, the sandworm is a thing of an altogether different level. Most conventional weapons are simply of no use. No force shy of atomics or massive artillery will bring a sandworm down, and the notion of standing against a sandworm without such weaponry is futile, if not suicidal. So basically, yeah, we're treating sandworms as an act of God, essentially. So if you're sort of facing a sandworm with no means of escape, it's a potential campaign ender. So there's either you're killed utterly by the sandworm, killed by the violence of its passing, or devoured within the atomic furnace of its interior. So your only hope is to get away, to, perhaps survive by some miracle. Basically, you should encourage players to view sandworms as the extremely dangerous, indestructible monsters they are, and treat them with respect that the Fremen do themselves. Then we have information about harvesting activities. So for harvesting activities, you need assets like spotter ornithopters. So they're fast maneuverable and have a quality of 2 or 3, to mark that out. You'll need a carry-all. So they're vital equipment to save harvesters from the danger of sandworms. Although their main purpose is to deploy harvesters, they're fast, but not as fast as ornithopters. Their quality can be any. They have armor, they can carry cargo, and they're flying, and they are very large because they can carry harvesters. Their size is large to huge, by the way. Nearly all harvesters belong to houses licensed to operate on Arrakis. They're massively expensive, but they have a limited lifespan as they are frequently devoured by sandworms or suffer other terminal accidents due to the conditions in which they operate. They talk about how the team will harvest the spice and the many dangers that can happen along the way. Then there's the initial processing, assuming you manage to get the spice back from the desert. And then there is the auditing and accounting, which happens in Arrakis. So the Emperor employs a great number of clerks and accountants who ensure no spice goes missing on its way to the space docks. Of course, there are, in fact, unlicensed operations, as we know, so the Fremen themselves pay off the guild using spice to stay invisible, and the Fremen retain spice for use in their seitches. They use it for food and for ritual purposes, so it's not a huge amount, but they do gather spice for things like that. And spice prospecting and mining can be done by freelance teams, unlicensed smugglers with their unlicensed harvesters, or by Fremen harvesting teams. So they use the knowledge of the desert to avoid detection, and they tend to avoid the big spice blows and go for other less easily detectable sources of spice. So after the harvesting, if you're not working for the ruling house, then you'll need to find some place to refine it, and then you'll need to make sure it doesn't go through any legitimate facilities, or you'll be facing some difficult questions. So you'll have underground businesses. You'll need contracts with fixers, spice merchants, and trustworthy independent harvesting teams. And so watch out for the retribution potentially of the Harkonnen or the Imperials themselves. Then it talks about how you can use merchants and fixers, spies and informers to help you indulge in this trade, a potential way to sell on Arrakis, and dealing with off-world trade, which is where there's real big profit to be made, but you have to make some arrangement with the guild. So then there's some tips on making a sort of spice harvesting team. Could even be a one-shot game. Where you start off being dropped in the desert with a harvester and ending with escaping the inevitable sandworm. A longer arc might involve the player characters getting their hands on a harvester, coming back with a haul, and selling it off to a fixer, patron, or undefined middle person. Or there could be an epic tale involving making a relationship with the guild and maybe, just maybe, uncovering the secret ways in which the guild is working with the Fremen. Very, very cool. So they outline some ideas for storylines in this mode. So perhaps you're working for a house, you're working for some investigators, looking for smugglers, you're working for the smugglers themselves, or you're working as Fremen gatherers. There are different roles for desert workers. You could be a spotter, looking for worm sign. You could be a mechanic using the harvester. You can be a fixer to negotiate with buyers and patrons. You could be a spice worker. You could be a driver. You could be a medic. You could work security to try and protect yourself from rival operations. And you could be a spy and infiltrate a rival team. And of course, there are plot hooks and challenges to go along with this activity, as you might imagine. Then we have Walk Without Rhythm. So here we have what's so special about Arrakis. And there's some really nice info here about what the day is like when you're living amongst the society of Arrakis itself. So not the seitches, but the cities themselves. There's diverse communities. There's artists, mercenaries, engineers. It's a class-based society, as is the rest of the Imperium. So you've got the noble classes, the businessmen, the artisans, and the working class, and of course the poor and the slums. The influence of the great houses is felt through the Emperor's whim. Whoever they decide should control Arrakis at any given time. To install a new house on a planet is a Byzantine affair, where the Emperor appoints a judge of the change, and that can set up a whole complicated transition period. His authority can be challenged, but basically the judge is expected to arbitrate and observe from perfect neutrality, even although the Emperor is likely to have his own interests in the outcome. But the judge has to kind of take into account what the Emperor really wants if they want to get through this with their career and their lives intact. Then there's the responsibilities of the governing house. Of course, the main focus is trying to get every last bit of spice you can, but the people will resent you if you don't provide them with the basics of life, including water, which is way more precious than spice to the normal people of Arrakis. And then there's some minor houses of Arrakis itself, which you may have to deal with. So even minor houses can get involved because there's so much wealth to be gained from a successful spice operation. In your daily life, there are lots of ways to get entertainment besides just trying not to get stabbed in the back by political enemies. There are indoor arcades and emporiums. You can find cool stuff like survival equipment, entertainment gear, fragrant rice, and finely crafted jewelry. There are the black markets where you can find drugs, booze, weapons, smuggled spice, and cheap water. Then you have entertainment venues, like lovely tea and coffee houses. Samuta dens, which is basically, Samuta is a drug that's not illegal. It's kind of like opium back in the day. So you can go to a place legally, but it's considered like not very clean to do so. And then there's the Arrakis Bazaar, which is sprawling open-air market, which we heard about before. And then we have some great NPC templates here for some everyday residents you might meet. So we've got artists, bounty hunters, craftspeople, Fremen craftsperson, Fremen ecologist, Fremen infiltrator, Fremen Sayadina. There you go. Lovely illustration to accompany that one. Fremen scout, Fremen warden, an informant. So this seems to be a guild informant, given the uniform here. Yes, indeed. So that seems to be a guild informant. Then we have market sellers. We have musicians. We have local mystics. So, these might be, these are kind of homegrown mystics rather than, Bene Gesserit, Reverend Mothers. But some of these people actually have some power on Arrakis because they live amongst and consume a hell of a lot of spice. So there'll be more people looking into the future and having prophecies than you might expect in other parts of the Imperium. So that's an interesting one aspect as well. Here's a typical ornithopter pilot, which is handy. Often useful, particularly if you want to travel your way over to Carthage. Proprietor, so this would be somebody who runs a pub or a cafe or some other kind of business. Spice manager, so these are the white-collar workers in the spice business. These are the people who make sure the weights and measures are correct and deal with the bureaucracy of the local house and the imperial politics involved. The spice operators are crew bosses, so they're the guys who kind of run things out in the sands. Spice workers, they're the guys and girls who harvest spice from the surface itself. They're strong, hardy, and often fatalistic because they frequently know that at any given moment they could be eaten by a sandworm. Then we have some details about the various factions of Dune. So besides the political factions, we have the bankers existing on the planet, of course, who are mostly affiliated with the guild. We have various courtesans. We have, of course, that opens you up to campaigns featuring sex and scandal, which can always be fun. There are criminal organizations operating outside the law of the noble houses. So kidnapping, extortion, arson, and murder. There are black marketeers, of course. There's a red light district in Carthage. Arrakis, in contrast, is more for white-collar crime like embezzlement, fraud, solari laundering, crooked accounts, etc. So there are smugglers as well galore because they're trying to get profit from spice and hopefully get away without getting eaten by a worm. The desert planet's a hostile environment, so also you have to import a lot of stuff. So importers tend to have a lot of influence. They bring in stuff that is difficult to obtain on Arrakis, like industrial machinery, electronic gear, construction equipment, vehicles, food and water, all that stuff. Then you have manufacturers. So this is people who make local stuff like still suits, and some of these are actually really competitive markets. We have mercenaries, of course. You might want to hire them to, protect you on a private sort of spice smuggling run. Houses will use them to fill out their ranks. There's plenty of work for a good mercenary on Arrakis. And we have the water merchants. Water sellers are, of course, very important to society, and they band together under the Water Peddlers Union. Participating members divide and share the work, coordinate routes, and divide the profits. So it's more efficient that way. The working people preserve every precious drop of water, but water merchants and sellers get families the water they need and houses the water they want. So a key part of the economy of Arrakis. Then there are some nice hot tips on basic campaign structures for Arrakis. So spice smuggling, always a good one. Lots of political intrigue potential, lots of battle potential. You could be Fremen or trying to run away from the Fremen. There will be wars with other smugglers, potentially the ruling house. And yeah, if the Landsraad gets involved, you're in big trouble. You could be Imperial agents, sort of weakening the spice industry, thwarting the development of alternatives. You could be a Fremen-based campaign, so your purpose there is to have a surviving community, serving Shai-Hulud, keeping faith in Fremen beliefs, and basically all your assets and industries will be focused around the siege and the desert environment, but it could include unique stuff like spice reserves and the water of life and all that kind of stuff. The Bene Gesserit, of course, are heavily involved in what's going on Arrakis. They are, the Sayadinas are typically from the Bene Gesserit order, and they will be trying to pass the traditional test of the Water of Life to gain the powers of a Reverend Mother. You could have a guerrillas and revolutionaries campaign. So the underground resistance to the ruling house is always bubbling under. So perhaps you could oppose the Imperium rule and whatever the current governing house feels like doing, which could also be an interesting campaign if you're in a more Star Wars-y type mood. Or you could be an explorer of the old empire looking for relics of the old world of Arrakis. So you could be running the campaign back in the past of Arrakis itself, or you could be looking for Zen-Suni artifacts or that kind of stuff. And then there are a couple of sample campaigns. So Shadows on the Sand is centering on a group of spice smugglers, and the House of Heslin is based around a merchant operation being developed by a minor house. They're trying to get a toehold on Arrakis. So they give you an outline of the spice smuggling campaign, who the PCs should be, the kind of gameplay that would come into effect, and major threats and events that could throw things off course. Likewise with the House of Heslin. Key locations, in this case, which would include things like dealing with smugglers potentially, Fremen seitches that you may need to be in contact with, and basically building local and political influence through the illegal spice trade, the cantinas, and social environments. And then finally we have the sample adventure, which I will skip as per usual. And there you go. As always, there is a code for a free PDF, which I have used, so don't get too excited. But yeah, so that is Sand and Dust, the Arrakis sourcebook. It's really, really excellent, particularly if you are a fan, as I am, of the first two books. I think that is kind of the peak of the Dune series. I note a lot of people on the forums for Modiphius are clamoring for stuff that is not set on Arrakis, which I always find a bit strange. I mean, yeah, you don't want to stay your campaign on Arrakis forever, but I mean, Arrakis is Dune. Dune is about Arrakis and the spice and everything that centers around it, and that through that locus of Dune, the planet, and its worms and the life cycle of the spice and so on, and the local Fremen and Paul Atreides, we get introduced to the wider world of the galaxy and this huge story of destiny and prophecy and so on. So whichever angle you look at, Dune itself, Arrakis, Desert Planet, is the centerpiece of the 6-book series in my view. It dips out of view for a while, but in the end it comes back. And I think if we were to continue the series for many more books, I'm going to pretend the sequels, by the way, by Brian Herbert don't exist, and I refuse to believe they exist. That Arrakis would in some way always be a special place. So for me, this was a fantastic purchase. There's loads of great stuff and ideas for non-traditional campaigns, including running a siege, being a Fremen tribe, or running smuggling operations, all sorts of cool stuff. Loads of great info about Arrakis and its past and present and its future as well, if you haven't read certain books, so do be careful about spoilers. But yeah, once again, great piece of work from the line developers on Dune. We will in later videos check out the other 2 recent supplements that have come out as well, so look forward to that. In the meantime, remember, stay safe, stay well, and fear is the mind killer. All right, take care. Bye-bye.